Welcome everybody to today's webinar by the IEA PVPS Task 1. Please hold the line and the webinar will begin shortly. Welcome everybody. Please hold the line and the webinar will begin shortly. All right, welcome everybody to today's webinar hosted by ISIS, the International Solar Energy Society, and conducted by the IEA PVPS Task 1 experts. We have our experts with us already. I ask that the experts mute and hide themselves whilst we are not yet in for the presentations. And I will get us started with a little introduction into ISIS and the work we do. So, who is ISIS? ISIS is a UN accredited membership NGO. We were founded in the 1950s and we have been accredited with the UN since 1992. We have members from all around the world, and that is individual and corporate members. And we are on a mission, and our mission is 100% renewable energy for all, used efficiently and wisely. And to this end, ISIS conducts a whole range of activities. One of them you are seeing today. But first off, we have biannual congresses. They take place all around the world. The next one that's coming up is going to be the ISIS Solar World Congress 2025 in Brazil, and I will give you some information on that later on. We also do what's called the Eurosun, and the next one of those is coming up in 2026. Additionally, you will probably be quite familiar with our two key publications, the Solar Energy Journal, which is a well-established and long-standing journal, and our new sister journal, the Solar Energy Advances Journal, which is a fully open access journal, also by ISIS. Additionally, we have our webinar series, and we try and provide at least one webinar per month, and we have education initiatives that take place both online and offline. We also do a infographic series, and we just launched earlier in this year our online solar energy museum, which hosts 60 plus years of solar energy history and research. Now, because I know we all want to get into the webinar, a quick word for the audience on the Q&A session. We will first hear the presentations by the speakers. Anytime you have a question that comes up for you, you can already start and type it in. There's a little box on the Zoom icon list where you can see the Q&A chat box. Type in your question there. When you send in a question, please keep it short and precise, and also ideally who the question is for, so that our moderator has a bit of an easier job in allocating the questions. And with that, I'm very happy to introduce you to our moderator for today. His name is Jarand. Jarand represents Norway in the IEA PVPS Executive Committee, as well as in Task 1. He is an engineer by training and currently is in the process of obtaining his PhD. So Jarand, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Arabella, and a very warm welcome from my side as well. My name is Jarand, as Arabella said, and I will be moderating this webinar. So that means that my task is just to introduce our speakers of today, and then also bring your questions forward to them at the end of the webinar. So since the topics and also the questions to the speakers can be overlapping, we will do both presentations back to back, and then we'll do the Q&A at the end. I said introducing our speakers, and I have to share my screen like this. So both our speakers are main authors of the report that we are presenting today, the trends report, and they are also, in fact, let's see if I can share. Yeah, task manager and deputy task manager of the Task 1 in the IEA PVPS. So I'll give a very short introduction to IEA PVPS and the task 1 before leaving the floor to our first speaker. So what is let's start with the IEA, so the International Energy Agency. Most of you will know, founded in 1974 in the framework of the OECD. And then we have the next keyword, which is the Technology Collaboration Program, or the TCPs, which is within the IEA created to increase collaboration, and there are a lot of different TCPs ranging different technologies. So coming on to the IEA PVPS, it's the Photovoltaic Power Systems Program, which is a TCP founded in 1993. And the goal is to enhance the international collaborative efforts, which facilitate the role of photovoltaic solar energy as a cornerstone in the transition to sustainable energy systems. So you can find more information on IEA PVPS on this website. So just to give you really the short story of IEA PVPS and Task 1. So I mentioned founded in 1993. And then our first trends report came out in 1995. So if I'm not mistaken, this is our 29th edition of the trends report, but first webinar. So we're excited to give you the key takeaways and an outcome from our report. And also we since 2013 have been coming with a snapshot earlier on the year, which sort of gives you the first numbers, and then the trends is a more thorough run through. So I think I will not go too much further. I will say that the task 1 and what makes this possible to write these reports is that we are a group of market and industry experts from a lot of different countries with the different situations. The focus is to understand markets, policy and industry trends. I think our work is very much shaped by the fact that we're a non-profit think tank, which does not have an agenda, but just collaborates on a non-profit basis. Yeah, I mentioned these 2 key reports. So without further ado, I think we will go to the first speaker of today, Mr. Gaëtan Masson. He is, I mentioned, the task manager and CEO and founder of the Becquerel Institute. He's also been active in founding the European Solar Manufacturing Council. And I think you'll have some nice insights to share with you all from the report. So please, Gaëtan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jarand. Thanks for the introduction, and let me share my screen. Do you see my screen properly?
Not in presentation mode yet.
No, it's coming. Or it should come. Do you see?
No, we got the other side of the presentation mode with the notes and the next.
Okay, no, I know what's the problem.
No worries.
Let me retry, and it's sorry for the inconvenience.
I think we're all good. I think we've been there before.
Yeah. No, it should be good.
Perfect. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thanks for the introduction, and sorry for the small delay. Indeed, I will not present myself. I'm the task manager of the IEA PVPS Task 1 since 2013. I'm really happy to share this with Izumi Kaizuka, who will present you more in the coming minutes. So I will not talk about myself. I'm involved in PV industry for now 15 years with a different background in Europe and globally, but I would like to focus much more on what's the subject of the day. So presenting that 29th edition, you're right, of the trends in PV applications. And I looked recently at the very first version, and you can find all of them on the IEA PVPS website. It's very interesting to look at how PV was perceived in 1995 when the very first edition of the report was published. And what we try to do during this year, and as you mentioned, Jarand, it's trying to have an unbiased and non-profit perspective on what's happening in the PV sector, on the technology, on markets, on policies driving PV development, on the industry development, on the impact on the society, including economics, jobs, and other aspects, but also, and I will come back on that, on the contribution to fighting climate change and much more. And I would like to say it's probably, if not the only, one of the few reports which have that global perspective for a very long time, using similar methodologies to assess the market and to understand what's happening, using the same vocabulary, which might be sometimes very confusing about policies and PV development. And as I was saying, I'm inviting to read all of them. You might need some nights. If we're looking at PV market development in recent years, we see that the development has been almost continuous, and we reached last year 456 gigawatt DC. You might find totally different numbers in the literature, including significantly lower ones. Our friends from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, for instance, are not publishing DC numbers, so the nominal power of the panels installed, but AC number, which refer to something more fuzzy, which might be the maximum power which can be injected into the grid. We have decided a long time ago, and we stick to that, to present you DC numbers, and these are the ones that allow in the best way to calculate also the energy produced by PV systems. Just to give a little bit some insights, China, of course, is by far the first country in terms of PV deployment. And indeed, you might see some discrepancies in numbers. We have decided to interpret it, not only Chinese, but numbers provided by a certain number of countries to align them and making sure that the methodology is the same. And even if numbers can differ, the shape of the curve remains the same, and that's the most important aspect. And I will come back on the major acceleration that we have seen in 2023. But what is also interesting is that if that acceleration has been globally caused by the development of the Chinese PV markets, the rest of the world has also progressed, less significantly, but anyway, we see a growth of the PV market globally, which has driven the market in 2023 at a level never seen before. And I would like also, and I'll come back on that, to remind you that production last year has been significantly higher than what has been installed. And I will come back, and my colleague Izumi Kaizuka as well, when she will discuss about the industry. Oops, I'm sorry about the details, but I'm going to tell you some interesting numbers. We are installing something like 1.5 gigawatts of PV every day, including Saturday and Sunday, and that's represents something like 52 megawatts installed every hour. So I'll let you count how much will be installed during this webinar. It's close to 1 megawatt every minute, and that's something quite impressive. It means if we translate that into a number of modules that we are installing, it's 2,000 modules installed every minute in the world. And we are producing a bit less than 1 billion PV module. It's quite an impressive number. And if we look at the surface that it represents, it's a square of 43 kilometers. That's so 43, not 43 square kilometers, but a square of 43 kilometers. That's can be covered with all the PV panels that are produced every year. It's huge, but it's not so huge. And it's not so huge, and the market needs to continue growing. And I'm coming back to looking a little bit what happened last year, because the tremendous numbers that we have seen in China, and you might see two different numbers because we have decided to reinterpret official Chinese numbers, as I was saying. These numbers are showing that in a certain number of countries in the world, we had no growth or limited growth. So when we are saying that the market grew significantly in 2023, it's not something that happened evenly around the world. And there are a certain number of countries where the market grew faster than others. China, of course, the US, the entire European Union, even if inside the EU, it's not always the case. And especially Italy and Germany that developed significantly, but also the French market, while some historical PV markets like Japan, Korea, or Australia, for instance, developed relatively little. And that means that there is still potential for growth that has been untapped until now. Going a little bit further, what does it mean in terms of total capacity of PV in the world? We reached more than 1.6 terawatts at the end of last year, or 1,642 gigawatts installed. And I will not transform that into megawatts and kilowatts, but 1.6 terawatts, it looks like it is huge. The 1 terawatt installed capacity threshold has been passed only a bit more than 2 years ago. And I really think that we will see something much more consistent in the coming decades with numbers above 1 terawatt being installed every year. And if we are looking a little bit in the past, just 10 years in the past, the market has been, the total installed capacity, has been multiplied by a factor more than 10. And it should be still be multiplied significantly if we really want PV to contribute to climate change. I would like to say a word about how relevant PVPS is. Still, you can see that the large part, the large blue bar corresponds to PVPS countries. And of course, there are a certain number of countries outside of the PVPS network from which we are gathering numbers thanks to a nice relationship. I'm thinking about India, for instance, or Brazil. But basically, the IEA PVPS is still quite a relevant organization in terms of understanding what's happening in the PV sector due to the extremely high coverage of the market it represents. If we're looking a little bit regionally, it's of course Asia Pacific which is dominating this total installed capacity. And that's logical because it represents the biggest in terms of inhabitants part of the world. And we can see that Europe is following, that the Americas are third, and that the rest of the world, including Middle East and Africa, still needs to grow. But if we correlate that with the wealth which is produced in every part of the world, then we start to understand that the combination between GDP and inhabitants explains why we are going in this direction, which will be comforted in the coming years, even if I think that the Middle East already now and Africa will contribute significantly more than what happened until now. I remind you that this is a total installed capacity. Now, when we are talking about PV, and that's a tough exercise, we are trying to separate the markets into different kind of segments, centralized and distributed. And that's how we have decided to call them some time ago. And centralized means basically utility scale PV plants injecting into the grid without self-consumption, while distributed installations mean smaller installations, mostly on rooftop, but not only, which are basically linked to self-consumption of electricity. And this has a certain number of consequences when we are looking at the business models. In the first case, very often we are dealing with, in countries where it exists, an electricity market and the electricity market prices as a competitiveness, I would say, metric for PV. And in distributed applications, very often on residential or commercial or industrial rooftops, the metric is the price of electricity, which is paid by the local consumers. There are some approximation because statistics in all countries are not built in the same way, but it gives quite an interesting perspective. And the perspective is that we have seen somehow until 2022 a decrease of the share of centralized installations, with distributed installations gaining speed in many countries. And it's logical because the policies behind distributed PV installations are more complex to put in place than for big systems. And we have seen a reverse of this segmentation change in 2023, and it's coming basically from the fact that massive installations, especially in China, were done as utility scale and not as distributed installations. But I believe that this is going to be rebalanced at some point, and that we will most probably converge towards a market 50% centralized utility scale application, whatever the kind of application, and 50% distributed. And what's also interesting is to see that depending on the region, the situation is not the same. So Asia Pacific is dominating by far, or is dominating in terms of centralized applications, while Europe in general and some other countries, Japan, for instance, are seeing much more distributed installations. And I'm going back to what I was saying before, it's more complex to put in place regulations for distributed applications, especially under self-consumption, real or virtual, than utility scale. The other point is that in many countries with a high population density, land is scarce and PV hence is developing more on rooftops than on the ground, but that's a different question. I will not say much about that because Izumi Kaizuka will speak about the industry later. But something that we have seen in the PV industry, and it's a trend for many years, is that production capacities have been significantly higher than the production itself. And in 2023, it hasn't changed, but what we can notice is that production capacity, and here it's just shown for PV modules, Izumi will probably show more than that, as grew significantly, leading, and the production also, leading to significant overcapacity, but also overproduction in the PV sector. And I was saying in one of the first slides that China increased its own market significantly to absorb a part of this overcapacity, but it wasn't sufficient. And we see for more than 1 year now, PV market price going down for PV components, mostly PV modules, but not only, at a point that starts endangering a part of the industry. And I will come back on that, is that maybe we have reached, with more than 450 gigawatt installed, a first important threshold in terms of PV development, and probably some kind of, not maximum, that's not the message I would like to pass, but we have reached a level where political commitment will need to accelerate in order to ensure further PV development in a certain number of geographies. And I'm just taking an example, which is the Spanish market in Europe, which has seen so much PV installation in the last years that basically market prices, so electricity market prices, start to decline, possibly at some point endangering the business models of future PV plants. And the solutions to fight that are going necessarily through policymakers and policy decision, which means that basically while PV has reached a certain level of competitiveness, now we need again some support from the electricity system in general and policymakers to organize PV deployment in a sustainable way in the coming years. And it just means, and I will have unfortunately no time to come back on that, that the future development of PV in the coming years will be again policy driven. Now I would like just to comment on some specific elements which we have analyzed in the trends report. And the first one is how to calculate the CO2 emissions avoided by PV. And you might have seen numbers higher than that in the last years. We have decided to change our methodology, but we're coming anyway on the idea that what has been installed in 2023 only saved almost 1 million tons sorry, not what has been installed in 2023. The total installed capacity at the end of 2023 is saving close to 1 billion tons of CO2. So 3% of all CO2 emissions. What we can see is that we have a certain number of countries where PV penetration is higher than 10%. In these countries, we consider that basically it's not peak load, which is now replaced by PV, but it's base load. And the calculation that we're making in the past, when PV was relatively, I would say, low in terms of penetration, is that PV was just shaving peaks and then replacing peak electricity production. Now, in these countries where the PV penetration is higher than 10%, we can say that PV is replacing base load power. And if it's replacing base load power, it's replacing different sources of electricity. And so the calculation that we did, if PV is replacing peak power, would lead to almost 2 gigatons of CO2 equivalent avoided. If we are thinking about base load, it's divided by 2. What is important is to realize that these numbers are extremely important. I was saying 3% of all, or 2.5% of all emissions. But if we are looking at the emissions of the energy sector, it's a number which is a bit higher. If we are looking at the emissions of the electricity sector, then PV is reducing it significantly, whatever its peak or base load power, the emissions of the electricity sector. And these numbers will be bettered thanks to the IEA PVPS Task 12 methodology, probably next year. It takes a lot of time to change the methodology itself, but I wanted to pass that message, and that's, in my opinion, something very important, is that PV, thanks to its nature, is contributing significantly to fight against climate change. Now I would like to give you another indicator, which is how much the PV business represents in terms of value globally. And we can debate about the total number, but basically if we look at market prices and what has been generated, we can say that PV represents at least 400 billion and probably even a bit more than that globally. And in some countries, the contribution of the PV markets to the contribution of the business value of the PV market to the GDP in some countries is far from being negligible. So we are below 1%, but it's not something which is as small as people could imagine. It's quite significant to have sometimes 0.5% of the economy of a country that depends already on PV. And from an industrial point of view, of course, it's China that definitively dominates. If we're looking at the economy in general, so what's the contribution of PV to the global GDP, we're at 0.4%. But if we are looking at all energy investment, it's more 3% last year, and power sector investment 1.23%. About employment in general, PV is contributing to something like 8 million jobs in the world, with China having the largest part, and it's logical since China represents a very large part of the industry and more than 50% of the market. So we're talking about something like 5 million jobs in China. But if we are just looking at Europe, it's almost 500,000 jobs. It's far from being negligible. And we have significant numbers in a certain number of countries. Now I would like just to give you a very small indication about how complex it can be to identify sometimes which are the price, which for PV modules. I will not speak about PV system. I'm showing here a figure which is coming from basically the countries which have reported indicative module prices. And what is interesting is that it's the final price for the final customer. It could be residential or it can be a huge utility scale application. And we can see that in 2023, the prices reported to the final customer were quite high. While, and that's the current spot price on the market, you could buy in 2023 price modules for around 50 cents, $50 on the market. Now you can find them in between 6 and 12 on the spot price. And it says, and that's a little bit what I wanted to say before, that due to overcapacities in the industry, mostly in China, for the time being, the price of PV modules, hence PV systems, is extremely low and probably unsustainably low. I would like to finish by some final numbers on PV contribution to the electricity demand in 2023. And we can see that in some countries, we have quite high numbers. It's the contribution to electricity demand, and I will come back on that, based on the PV installed capacity at the end of the year. What does that mean? It means that if we are looking at the PV installed capacity on the 1st of January, and we look at the production that this PV fleet could produce, and we compare that to the electricity demand, then we reach that level of penetration, and it allows to compare things which otherwise would be apples and pears. But it says that in more than 10 countries, we have a penetration which is higher than 10%, or in almost 20 countries, more than 10% of the electricity demand. And in some countries, we are already above 20%. And all that happened in less than 15 years. I would even say in less than 10 years. And if we are looking at a very conventional statistics, which is the share of renewable in the global electricity production in 2023, we see that the share of PV is about 5.4%. Wind is a little bit below 8%. If we take hydropower together and other renewable energy sources, we are around 31%. So it means that we still have 70% which are coming from conventional sources, but this number is evolving rapidly. Now, are these numbers realistic? And that's one of the very interesting elements I wanted to present you today. If we calculate the percentage of electricity production or the percentage of PV with regard to the electricity demand, we have a totally different number. And why? It's because in the case of electricity production, we might have in many countries huge losses. And so I would be really in favor to look at PV, which is producing most of the time locally or very locally. So with extremely limited losses, I would like to look at the fact that PV represents 8.3% of the electricity demand globally. Looking at the electricity production, which is a conventional indicator, is my opinion something that gives a reduced and false impression of the penetration of PV. We're at 8.3%. It means that at the end of this year, we will be probably around 10%, and that's a major milestone. You will find some infographics that you can use in the trends with most of the numbers which have been explained. And I think it's very important to be fact-driven and data-driven when we're looking at the fast evolution of PV. So don't hesitate to use this. And I will finish by that. I was starting by saying that PV was a growing market, but the growth outside of China was significantly less important than the global growth that we have seen thanks to China. As I've mentioned, the growth in China came from the need of China to absorb a part of its overcapacity. It's not good or bad, it's a fact that led to a very huge market in 2023. But looking a little bit more in detail, we can see that the growth outside of China was not that important, and that to a certain extent, the PV market is growing, yes, but the PV market outside of China has barely reached 200 gigawatts. It's even a bit less than that. It's not bad, but it's not as important as the final number could lead to think. I was saying 8.3% of the electricity consumption in the world coming from PV. That's quite a milestone, and I will be really happy to say 10% next year. A significant part of the global economy, and we don't need to record the number, but much more the fact that indeed PV is now a very large, complex industry participating not only to decarbonization, but also to economic growth and to a change towards a cleaner future. And indeed, you have seen that with regard to CO2 emission reduction, the methodology can change totally the way how we calculate numbers. But one thing is sure is that the contribution of PV is very important, and it's more important in terms of CO2 emission reduction than its share in the electricity system. I was mentioning that we have extremely low prices on the PV market, which are coming from an imbalance between production and consumption of PV components. That won't last, but that won't change the economics of PV, which is globally competitive with almost everything, and which means that without discussing about forecast, IEA PVPS is not doing forecast. The IEA is doing. We consider that the IEA in general is pretty conservative in terms of forecast, which is something good because it means that a very conservative organization has understood the value of PV. And the IEA is saying now that we will go towards 1 terawatt per year. I personally think that this number will be reached around 2030 and that it will continue growing in the coming years. Most serious scenarios about decarbonization are showing that we would need 3 terawatt of PV per year to fight climate change seriously by electrifying everything, transport, heating, and the industry. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gaëtan, for a very, very comprehensive and interesting presentations. So we will do the questions to you as well after Izumi's presentation. I will just remind the audience that you can ask your questions now in the Q&A box. There's already been some interesting questions which we can look forward to have answered later. There's also the opportunity to upvote questions that you find interesting. So that way you can help us sort of sort which one to get to if there are too many. So there are some questions already asked, and there are also some questions already answered, which are more about distribution of the slides. So they will be made available for everyone at the home pages, both of IEA PVPS and the ISS. So that being said, I will like to introduce our next speaker, Izumi Kaizuka. She is the director and principal analyst at the RTS Corporation in Tokyo, and specializing in the both PV market analysis, policy, and business models, but has a really important part also in analyzing the industrial part of the PV sector and in the trends report. So she's also, as I mentioned, a main author together with Gaëtan, Masson and Mélodie Delépine of this report, and we're very proud to have Izumi as our deputy task manager. Also, for instance, since she was awarded and honored with a special award at the PVSec 2017 for her contributions. So I think you all can look forward to hear what Izumi has to say. And Izumi-san, the floor is yours. Take some time to get your screen shared.
Thank you, Jarand. Let me share my screen. So now I'm in China, so it may take a little bit of the time. Can you see my screen?
It's
now?
sort of coming up, not there quite yet, but I think it's in the process. We'll just give it some more seconds and I'm sure it will come up.
Coming up?
Not quite yet, but it says that Oh, now it went away again. Are you trying one more time, or?
Is it now?
Yes, that's perfect,
So,
Izumi.
I immediately goes to my presentation. Anyway, thank you for the, I'd like to thank you, Arabella, having this opportunity. And this introduction for Jarand. Here is my contents.
I think we've lost Izumi. Izumi, if you're still there, try turning off your camera. Maybe that's gonna lessen the load on your connection.
Okay, I think Izumi is trying to reconnect again. Maybe we should then get Gaëtan back on and answering one of the questions that has come up while Izumi is reconnecting. So we can be efficient here with everyone's time. So there's one question that has gotten 2 upvotes, so we'll just go straight for that. And that's to Gaëtan. Which variables or factors will have the strongest impact on the PV prices and PV penetration the next years? Can you try to answer that and see if we can get Izumi back on while you speak?
So I think there are two elements which should be disconnected. It's PV prices, so I assume PV system prices on one side, and the PV penetration itself. On PV prices, we have huge overcapacities in China. There is no doubt, and basic laws of supply and demand are making that either you need to increase supply or reduce supply or increase demand if you want price to go back to more sustainable levels. And I think that both will happen, that demand will increase, but not as fast as it could be expected. And that some supply might be reduced by some companies being simply bankrupt, or some companies deciding to produce less. That's one thing. On the drivers that will feed the growth of the PV market in the coming years. The first one is competitiveness. It's in many countries where there are not so many grid limitations. PV will develop simply because it has become one of the cheapest, if not the cheapest source of energy, and not only electricity. And we still have more than 1 billion of people in the world who lack access to electricity. I can tell you, being involved in projects in Africa, that Africa is somehow going to lead a part of PV development in the coming years. Now, without going too much into detail, new business models like green hydrogen or green ammonia production might drive a part of the massive PV development that we will see in the 5 to 10 coming years. And we still have countries, I'm mentioning Egypt or Morocco, but they are not the same, that have big plans about using PV, to use PV for green hydrogen production.
Thank you, Gaëtan. It seems Izumi is still connecting up. So let's do one of the questions you already answered in the chat, but bring it out in the webinar. So yes, let's do this. This has 2 upvotes as well. So how come China roughly installed 4 times as much as Europe and produced 80% of all modules globally? last year, whereas Europe has almost no production. However, China created 5 million jobs, and Europe, maybe here's the misunderstanding, around 4 million jobs. Can you shed some light?
I think democracy, as I was writing, has many advantages, but it has one drawback, is that it's significantly slower than a dictatorship when some decisions must be taken. But it can be good or bad decisions. In the case of China, it was a good decision. And more than 15 years ago, China decided that the energy transition would be worth investing massively. And that's what happened not only in PV, in electric vehicles, in batteries, and in other elements. So that's basically while in the Western world, and especially in Europe, conventional utilities were lobbying like hell to delay as much as possible the energy transition and PV and wind development. The Chinese PV industry was developing and is now in a situation of extreme dominance, and it's coming from the right decision being taken at the right moment. Now, about accelerating PV development, it can be extremely complex, but I think that in terms of PV penetration, Europe is not shouldn't receive any lesson from anyone. We have quite an interesting PV penetration in Europe, and it's growing. But it's more the question of the industry, and I repeat it again, it's a question of complete blindness of many stakeholders in the energy sector and many policymakers who refused to see that PV would be the future of the energy sector and tried as much as possible to delay its development. And I'm speaking for the Europeans, we are paying it right now, hardly.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, let's do one more and hope that Izumi can get her connection back on track. So there's, you briefly touched upon sort of the business models of PV, and there's one question here. So that's how to simulate the adoption of distributed PV in Middle East or regions where electricity is subsidized and you don't have this alternative or intuitive alternative price.
It's a very complex question because you're right. In many countries, not only in the Middle East or in North Africa, electricity for private users is very often subsidized with extremely low price. While in Western countries is exactly the opposite. You pay more as an house owner than an industry if you consume electricity. This is changing anyway because it costs increasingly more to many countries to subsidize extremely low electricity price for even a part of the population. And the other element is that if we look at the competitiveness, the intrinsic competitiveness of PV, PV is competitive even with these extremely low prices. So it's not an incentive yet because electricity prices are too low or the difference is not significant. But I really think that in the coming years, these governments will start pushing a lot for PV installation in order simply to save public money while keeping extremely low prices for the part of the population that cannot afford to pay much more for it.
Thank you. Have you heard from Izumi, Arabella? Should we just crack on with the questions that are not super related to Izumi's presentation and then?
Yeah, I do think we need to basically move on and just having questions for now. I resent her the link, but I can't see her trying to get on. So it seems she's kind of not able to get on the call at all. So I think questions for now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Perfect. I think you're doing a great job of keeping the interest up, Gaëtan. So there are some more interesting questions here. So let's go to one that also touches on the CO2 calculations that you showed in your presentation. So when you do calculate the CO2 saved by PV installations, how do you deal with the calculation of the embodied emissions of the modules based on their production?
Yes, we do, because it relates to it's a very complex calculation, because if you look at the CO2 content of a PV panel, it depends on many things. First, it depends on where metallurgical silicon is being produced. It depends where the polysilicon is being produced, and then wafers, cells, and the module part is less important because it contributes marginally to energy consumption. But the other part is where the PV module has been installed. If I'm taking a country like Spain, for instance, you have a difference from 1 to 2 in terms of electricity production, depending on whether you're in the north or you are in the sunniest region in the south. And of course, if you produce twice more electricity with the same PV panel, you will have significantly more CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour, depending on where you are. So we try to incorporate all that in the calculation. When you look at the CO2 content of most of the PV modules, it's not that high. And in the worst case, we are about 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour in the absolute worst case, and we are around 10 grams in the best case. I would like a little bit to fight common belief about the CO2 content of PV, which is coming from China. The CO2 content of PV modules produced in China is not that bad. First, because many companies are producing their own renewable electricity. That's the first thing. And second, because the massive development of PV in China in the last years has diminished the average CO2 emission of the country, and it will continue very fast. So in that kind of calculation, I think the final number depends on the methodology, and the methodology can be always criticized. But the message which is behind is that PV significantly contributes to reducing CO2 emissions globally. Whether it's 1 gigaton or 2 gigatons, the reality is probably in between. But it says basically that electricity which is consumed and which has been produced by PV, if it would have been produced by another conventional source, it would have emitted significantly more electricity than what it is today. And that's the rationale behind the calculation.
Thanks. Maybe we should follow up on the sustainability track. There's a question on the other side of the coin, final scrap and recovery. How far is it being beneficial for future growth in alignment to sustainability? So the circular economy.
So recycling is absolutely essential. It's not just because it's PV, it's also because of the amount of material that we need to use to produce enough PV. I was mentioning 1 billion PV module per year. That will require at some point to go through recycling. And then basically we have little examples of successful business models for the time being, simply because we haven't decommissioned that many PV modules for the beginning of the PV era. So it's gonna come in the 5 to 10 coming years, massively. And there was an excellent paper at the last European PV Sec in Vienna in September about how reusing silver from existing PV modules that will be decommissioned would alleviate the pressure on the silver market, for instance. So this is something that will be needed in the same way that recycling the scrap from cutting wafers will need to happen as well. But we are not there yet, and that's not a question of will, and that's not a question of technology. It's in most cases a question of business models. Now I could go a little bit further and saying there are questions about whether glass with antimonium can be recycled in PV modules or whether it should be downcycled for other uses. And there are questions about what kind of, I would say, encapsulants should be used in order to ease the recycling. These questions are at the core of PV module design for the time being. Can just tell you that the industry is struggling so much for the time being due to extremely low prices, below production cost in many cases, that might be for the next round of profit in the industry, so maybe in 2-3 years. But it's a question which is heavily discussed, tested, and already implemented in many cases. Just that the business model for recycling is not yet there. As I was saying, it's going to come.
And we should say, as also Melody points out in the chat, that the IEA PVPS has an own task 12 on sustainability. So also in our trends report, we based our calculation on the task 12 figures.
Yes, I think that's very important. It's task 1 is just one of the tasks of PVPS. And some of the other ones are more technical about specific subjects. And I invite all of you to go on the IEA PVPS website and to look at what is done. And so task 12 is a task about sustainability, not only recycling. There are many things about quality and reliability in task 13, about grid integration in task 14, about BIPV, VIPV, solar resource PV in emerging countries, and soon photovoltaics and much more.
Thank you. There are also 2 questions on the figure you presented on the footprint, the 43 kilometers squared.
Yes,
or the square of 43.
It was a mistake in the slides. I just did a very simple calculation. This what would be the area that would be covered by all the PV modules produced on an annual basis, and it's roughly 1,600 square kilometers. So you can imagine a square with a side of 43 kilometers. And
yes.
Is it big? Is it small? If you look at the most ambitious scenario for PV development, which has been done by our colleague and friend, Dr. Christian Breyer from Lappeenranta University of Technology in Finland, if we go for 140 terawatt of PV to decarbonize and electrify everything, then we need more or less a square of 1,500 kilometers. And that can be put without any problem in one of the desertic places in the world. We don't need to cover the entire Norway, for instance. Just to take an example.
Okay, thank you. So I guess we maybe have to face that we lost Izumi-san. So her part was covering some of the industry, more upstream figures than what you said, Gaëtan. Would you like to sort of, I think Arabella has her presentation. Would you like to run through? Or yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just a second so that I can share the presentation with everybody.
And then we can sort of, we envisioned this going on for 1.5 hours. So if you do it quite shortly, with not so many details that maybe Izumi had planned for, and we can still have some time for the final questions, and those will be the ones that get the most upvotes. So the participants can choose.
Okay. So I will make comments about the slides of Izumi. Of course, I'm not Izumi, but I would like to say one word about Izumi's involvement in IEA Task 1 for now 20 years. And RTS Corporation is a Japanese company where Izumi has a key role and which is providing data analysis on the PV sector, not only in Japan, but in Asia and globally in general, and with a focus on the industry. And that's why she's so relevant for this kind of presentation. Maybe you can go to the next one, and even the one after. So we are coming back to the figure I was showing, but Izumi is showing it with more detail. She's producing these numbers. What you can see is that basically in 2023, as we were saying, we had a certain level of installation. We have production, which was significantly higher, and it's the case for the second year in a row. There's been always, and it was one of the questions, there's been always a discrepancy because of the market growth, so expectation of market growth. But what happened in the last 2 years went significantly further than that. And we might see a market around maybe between 500 and 600 gigawatt this year, but we also expect that the production will be higher. And the issue is that the production capacities have also increased. And I think that in the coming slides, we'll know more about that. And just to start with that, so these are the figures that you can find in the trends report, is that the share of China in almost all steps of the value chain, so in polysilicon production, in wafer production, cell and module production, is extremely dominant, and it has even increased from 2022 to 2023. And here we're talking about production capacities, but it's in I would say polysilicon wafer cells and modules, but it's also the case for inverters, all materials, including glass encapsulants, but also equipment at all levels of the value chain, to the extent in some very specific segments for wafer production, for instance, ingot and wafer production, China is almost the only country manufacturing some type of equipment. We have seen trade barriers, especially in the US and in India, but also to a certain extent, even if it's limited in Europe, trying to rebalance this, but so far with limited success. And China has such an integrated, efficient value chain in PV, is that it will be a challenge in any case. I'm not saying that it's impossible. I haven't said that, but it's a real challenge for any new entrants on the market for the time being. You can switch next slide. So Izumi summarized all the trade issues existing a little bit everywhere and affecting mostly Chinese imports. But sometimes it went into the other direction with China taking countermeasures, especially against the US and against South Korea. I will not go too much into detail, but I was saying in my own presentation that PV is becoming a key element of the global economy, and of course there are trade frictions leading to reactions from a certain number of countries or group of countries which would like to have their own industry, and it's the case in the US, it's the case in India, but also Turkey, and to a lesser extent in the EU. Can go to the next one. I will again not go too much into detail, but if we are looking at the US, India, and Europe, and there is a willingness in these three countries or group of countries to go for domestic manufacturing, the method which has been applied differs significantly. The USA went for anti-dumping and countervailing duties, but also safeguard duties. And they implemented the so-called Uyghur Forced Labor Provisional Act in 2020 with the clear idea to limit, if not to stop, imports of Chinese products in the US. And in the meantime, the US put in place a certain number of positive regulations aiming at bringing back the industry in the USA. And so far, it starts to work because many projects have been announced or are in development. Since the Chinese industry has expanded mostly in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, for instance, the Americans are increasingly modifying their regulation to be sure that the anti-dumping and countervailing duties are not circumvented through these countries. In India, there is a real willingness to locally produce at least cells and modules, but there are plans for much more than that, including polysilicon and ingot wafers. And India has decided to impose trade tariffs, which aim definitively at creating a safe haven for their own production. And that's also what's happening with most probably gigawatt scale production in India, hitting the market before the US one. And I can say that to a certain extent, the European Union, which is more cautious with such an approach towards China, is simply trying to, I would say, to protect a part of its market, and it will be done through the Net Zero Industry Act, which has been announced just a few months ago. It will not be on the short term something blocking imports, but something favoring European manufacturers so that they could benefit from some segments on the markets. The EU has also voted a ban on distribution of product produced using forced labor in China, but it will not be implemented before 2027. We can go to the next one. So here, these are numbers which have been compiled by Izumi Kaizuka and her team, and showing in the first 2 quarters of 2024, the increase of production along the value chain. And what we can see is that production of polysilicon has increased significantly. I will not comment on that, but it shows that basically, even if the production was quite important last year, it continued growing this year. Crystalline silicon wafers, which represent more than 96 or 97% of the global PV markets, has also continued to grow, while we had 253 gigawatt produced last year, we had the equivalent of more than 40 this year. And you can see already the discrepancies at the next level. From a cell point of view, we went from 225 to 310. A part of the difference is coming from these overseas cell production from the Chinese, but they are not so important. So we can estimate here that many wafers produced in 2024, at least the first part of the year, are in inventories. And if we're looking at modules, the growth was quite important, because we went from 205 to 271, but also thanks to overseas Chinese manufacturers and the sales of wafer and cells to non-Chinese producers, the growth was a little bit less important. But if we look at these 4 figures, basically we can see that in 2 years, here we're just comparing the 2 first quarters of the year, the growth was quite significant for polysilicon, ingot and wafers, cells, and PV modules. So if we had an overproduction in 2023, that overproduction might be even higher in 2024. Can we go to the next slide, please? So Izumi's company compiled the announcement of shipments by Chinese suppliers, and you can see the change of scale from 2022 to 2023, and from 2023 to the first 2 quarters of 2024. And there are always some changes. Jinko Solar has taken the lead with almost 44 gigawatts shipped in the first 2 quarters, followed by GA and Trina. We can see that a company like Longi, that was number 1 in 2022, is going down slowly in the rankings, and that some others are progressing. And it's a little bit the story of the entire PV manufacturing ecosystem in China, is that we see rapid changes in the companies, some growing faster than others. But just to give an indication of what these numbers represent, Jinko that shipped 78.5 gigawatt in 2023, it's more than the entire European PV market, which is the second market in the world after China. So maybe we have reached a level of gigantism that will need in the coming years some significant market development in order to be absorbed. Another interesting element here is that we have definitively 4 key leaders in the market. It's Jinko, GA, Trina, and Longi. To a certain extent, Tongwei, but Tongwei is extremely present on the polysilicon and cell manufacturing, and Chint, I would say. And after that, numbers are significantly lower, but they are in any case more important in terms of shipments than any of the projects in India, in the US, or in Europe which have been announced. So the dominance of China in the PV industry will remain for at least a certain number of years, even thanks to the huge support that we can see in the India or the US, for instance. Next slide, please. Again, when we are looking at the announcement of production capacities expansion for the coming years, there are two things which are quite important. First, is that expansion in 2024 for some companies has been limited. We can see that a company like LONGi, for instance, hasn't increased production capacities, but has planned for 2026. Plans to expand production capacities at a level unseen until now for wafers, up to 200 gigawatts. We all know that for wafers, LONGi dominates the market, but they want also to be extremely dynamic on the module size. We see that Jinko has huge plans as well. And I will not go into detail, but if you look a little bit more, each of the company, you will see that the business model is not always the same. And that, for instance, I can compare LONGi, which is producing a lot of wafers, less cells. They have plans to expand cell production, but they anyway producing less cells than wafers and more modules. And we have Tongwei on the other side, which is almost not producing wafers, producing a lot of cells and producing less modules. And if we look at all these companies together, it's what I'm calling in general the Chinese black box. So is that it's not the business model of one company that should be looked at, but the business model of all the companies together. And we don't need to be extremely smart to see that, for instance, Jinko is buying cells on the market. That Jinko is not manufacturing all its cells itself. Same thing for LONGi. That LONGi is selling wafers to competitors producing cells massively, for instance, Tongwei, and so on and so on. Which means that basically these companies have the possibility to buy part of their consumption either of wafers or cells from other manufacturers. And then, since the price on the market is significantly lower than what you can find in the industry, it can allow for some time to gain some competitive advantage. And that explains how smart all that organization of the Chinese PV industry has become.
Yes, I will try to wrap up in 5 minutes, and then we go for the final questions.
Please go to the next one. I will not spend too much time on that because I think that the price outlook is smart, but should be questioned. Is that basically the IEA says that the price of PV module should stabilize around, let's say, 15 cents US dollar, 15 US dollar cent per watt by 2028. And indeed, that's what calculations are showing, is that in 2024, module should be sent a little bit below 20 US dollar cent per watt in order for companies to do some profit. And indeed, the price are significantly higher than when we are looking at the US market and also some other closed markets. Next slide, please. Again, I will not spend too much time on that, but that's basically the historical evolution of polysilicon wafer cells and module prices in the last years. And we had extremely low prices 5 years ago, due basically to already overcapacities in the market and a relatively low dynamic market. Then prices went up mostly because the demand was going higher and the polysilicon prices went up for many reasons, to be too long to explain here. And since the end of 2022, we see prices crashing to a level, and that's quite interesting for cells, and that's quite interesting for modules as well. Prices are below, and that's the pink bands that Izumi has put in the presentation. It's showing basically that companies producing polysilicon, wafer cells, and modules now have a market price which is below their own production cost. And that's something that explains why a company like LONGi has lost almost $1 billion US in the last 3 quarters, Next slide, please. That one is quite interesting. Izumi explained that at the last SNEC conference in Shanghai in June, the mood in the industry was extremely bad, and that's the key word that was repeated again and again was the word involution, which can be translated by you can do whatever you want, you can be as best as you can, nothing is progressing. And that's a little bit the situation of that's the hamster in the wheel. It's basically the poor animal that's running faster and faster, but the situation is not changing. And indeed, the Chinese PV industry is facing a very serious situation due to excessive competition, and that's coming from the severe imbalance in supply and demand. That, in my opinion, will not be solved thanks to market growth. It will not happen fast enough. It will be solved by some company bankruptcies. And that explains why the mood is so bad, and also why we shouldn't bet too much on extremely low prices, as we see for the time being. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's, I will go fast, but that's an example of how some companies in the polysilicon sector, like Daco and Zenith Energy, for instance, are losing money. They have a spot price for the time being, which is below their own average manufacturing cost. I don't have to explain you that manufacturing cost is not even the threshold, because you have to add a certain number of other costs in the industry, and you have to add profit. And so bankruptcies are coming, consolidation is coming, and the Chinese government has announced that it wants to address its excessive manufacturing capacity by changing a certain number of things. We don't know exactly what yet in the PV industry. Next slide, please. So what they would like to do is to impose stricter rules. I will really not spend time on that. So if Izumi could come back, that would be great. But that's basically the Chinese industry will be submitted to more technology constraints that will eliminate a certain number of laggers in the market and focus on the best actors. And maybe, Izumi, if you're there, I would love if you could finish your own presentation, which I try to respect as much as possible, having followed you many times.
I'm very sorry for the connection, disrupted suddenly.
It's okay. It's okay, Izumi. We're sort of trying to manage. Would of course have loved to have you
so
presenting, but
Yes.
we are sort of in the phase of wrapping up and going for the last questions. We did some questions after Gaëtan's presentation, but yeah, I don't know how many slides there are left, but ideally we should try to wrap up in a sort of 3 minutes.
Okay. So what I wanted to say is the Chinese government try to control the over supply and demand gap. That's the reason they try to implement the new requirement for the manufacturers. Then could you go to the next slide? But still the manufacturers has a plan for the enhancement. Recently we saw some slowdown of the manufacturing plan, but still they have the enhancement. And also most of the PV companies increase the manufacturing capacity of the new types of the N-type higher efficiency products. Please go to the next slide. And the PAC is the major technology last year, but this year the N-type TOPCon will take place the standard product. Then could you go to the next slide? So now I'd like to tell you some about the technological development for cost reduction. Because of the new types of the structure, they need more silver consumption. So the companies now try to reduce the silver consumption, because now 16% of the silver demand is used for the solar cells. And if this our terawatt market era is coming, the silver price could be the problem for the production. And especially for reduction, now the silver coated copper is adapted for some companies, but still this type of the new technology, the reliability should be studied. Okay, please go to the next slide. Then next slide. And also the still I'd like to tell you that still we have the good price reduction opportunities. Please go ahead. And here is the summary of the technologies adapting for the cost reduction or to gain the higher efficiency. Could you go to the next slide? Then, sorry, this is overlapping. Could you go to the next one? Yes, but still besides the technology, we have the way to reduce the cost. One, the important thing is the standardization. Now many manufacturers adapting the different size of the PV modules, so that we have the different size of the PV modules and needs to adapt to the according to size of the structures, or different support structures could be different, and the trackers could be need to adjust according to the size of the PV modules. But next slide, please. Some major companies now agreed to have the same size of the PV modules. This should be contribute to the cost reduction, also the kilowatt hour cost reduction as well, because the materials can be unified size, and also as I said, the support structure could be standardized as well. And now I'd like to summarize my presentation. Please, manufacturing capacity is 1 terawatt per year, and that's the demand and supply gap. It is the quite lower price trend. China dominates supply chain, but because of the local manufacturing support measures, we will see more diversified production side. And now industry consolidation should be proceeded, and there are space for the cost reduction with standardization, material, and new technologies. But new technology should be need to be ensure reliability, and sustainable investment is key, I believe, for the future growth of the industry and market. Thank you for your attention. The next slide, please. This is advertisement, the workshop we are planning in Japan. Please join the workshop if you have the plan to attend PVX 35. And the last slide, please. I need to thank to NEDO for the support of the PVPS activities. I'm really sorry for the disruption of the connection.
Thank you so much, Izumi. It's we missed you, but I guess that the participants in the webinar will have to read the trends report themselves to get all your insights, and I can assure you that Gaëtan did a good job covering for you on the first slides of your presentation. So thank you so much. We have 7 more minutes for questions, so let's use them for the best. there are a couple of questions still not answered in the Q&A session. So I will start following up on the industry. You can choose who wants to answer, but it's about India's manufacturing. So how much impact of India's manufacturing initiative is expected? Will it drive prices down or effective in reducing imports? Anyone want to answer them out loud in the webinar?
I would be keen in letting the floor to Izumi, since I've monopolized the word.
Izumi-san, please.
Sorry, I couldn't catch the.
So the question is really about manufacturing in India. How will it affect this situation?
The manufacturing in India, I think India has now the very big market. But if I add all the manufacturing plant, the capacity is far beyond the Indian market size. So if all the plant will be completed, India could import the PV modules outside of the India, and actually the imported volume of the PV module from India to United States is now increasing. So it could change the some framework, but I'm afraid the India still need to produce the wafer or sell by themselves, and still Indian industries depends on the China. And for the cost competition, Indian industry need to have more domestic capacity of the materials they use for the PV modules.
Thank you. Thanks. So let's do another question. I'll direct it to Gaëtan. So there's a question. May I ask whether the land use of PV causes any problems in the long term? This has been on Task One's discussion list.
It's a very good question, because it's a question about social acceptance. I was saying that all the PV necessary in the world could fit in a square of 1,500 kilometers of side in the middle of the desert, but we all know that's not going to happen like that. So it's more a question of starting to compete with recreational use of space. And we already see some backlash. So I think the question how it could be solved is simple, but in the reality, it's much more complex. It will be using as much as possible the built environment for first the buildings, then making sure that PV will be combined with other activities like agricultural PV and so on, in order to minimize the use of PV or the presence of PV in fields without any other use. But I fully agree it's going to be a challenge, and more in countries with a high population density than in others. And we see it already. So I think the problem is very, very complex, and it will depend on the political acceptance of PV. And in that respect, I would hope, as we see in India for the time being, that all political parties could support PV and not make it, as it can be in many European countries for the time being, or in the US, a political stance to be in favor or against PV, depending on your political orientation, because that is damaging significantly the energy transition.
Thank you. So what we'll do one more question from the audience, and then I have one last question, which I came up with now. So this is more a statement. So let's see if it goes to both of you. Overcapacity module production, I guess, means that an expected high increase in PV power installations in the near future. Do you agree? Both of you can give a short answer. Izumi-san, you go first.
Yes.
Did you get the question? This overcapacity of the production, will it necessarily lead to a high increase in PV power installation in the near future?
I think that it can be stimulate to the market, especially in the emerging market.
Gaëtan, do you agree?
And make it short, I agree, but I don't think that it will be sufficient to close the gap with extremely high production capacities. Not immediately, at least.
Okay, and rounding up, my last question would be for all the audience, what are the sort of the key things and why should they follow the activities of the IEA PVPS going on? What are we, what's our goal and how can they, what insights can they find from us in the near future? It goes to you, Gaëtan, as the task manager of task one.
So what task one will focus on in the coming years, it's how to accelerate PV market developments. So many of the questions which have been asked and which are totally genuine will be at the core of our discussion, including the question of social acceptance, PV everywhere, the question of grid integration, and if you need to curtail electricity, how much you will lose in terms of business model, or you can be compensated. And I could say it in 15 seconds. I think PV, I was saying in the beginning, PV will be policy driven or not in the coming years. So it requires a very large acceptance of the population for a massive electrification of everything, the massive use of PV. And that's a very, very complex question to be solved. I'm just taking a second because I had no time until now. It's to thank my team and especially Melody Dlepin, who contributed significantly to writing this trends report and who had answered personally to many of the questions you asked.
Perfect. I think from our side, we thank everyone for staying and listening, and the report can be downloaded for free at the PVPS website. And yes, I think further question has to be directed to us in any kind of channels. So you'll find us on LinkedIn and other social media. So from our side, thank you, Izumi and Gaëtan again. Thank you so much. And see you later.
Thanks, Jarand. Thanks, Arabella. Thanks
Thank
to
you.
all of you to stay online. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you to everybody from our side here at ICES as well. We made it with a presentation done by two. That's really good. Very well done. And so before we close out the webinar, I'm just going to give you a few more quick infos that you may need. One is the question about the webinar recording as well as the presentations. So this webinar is just in the process of being recorded. The presentations have been submitted to us by the presenters, and we will put up those resources on the ICES and the IEA PVPS homepages in a few days. For ICES members on the call, remember you have unlimited access to all webinars in the ICES webinars area. And finally, a word from ICES on the next upcoming conference as well. We are very happy to share the save the date with you for the ICES Solar World Congress 2025. It's going to take us to Brazil next year in November. Super exciting conference, especially because COP will take place just a few days even after that conference has closed. So we will be right there in a very interesting political climate, bringing the latest in solar research. PV obviously is a huge topic in Brazil. So if any of you are interested, you can stay up to date about that conference on our homepage, which is www.ices.org. Yeah, and we are looking forward to seeing many of you joining us in Brazil. And with that, I'm happy to close the webinar. Thank you, Izumi, Jarand, and Gaëtan for joining us. Thank you to the audience for joining us as well, and a very lively Q&A session. And we will see you on the next webinar. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.